Hi there, welcome to my video tutorial. I'm going to show you how I made this canvas. It was inspired by the topic of colour, which was over on Simon Says Stamp and Show challenge site, and I do love a challenge, and I think I challenged myself a little bit more than I anticipated here, and I'm all bowed out. If you want to know how to make these bows, and I suggest you practice on slightly bigger squares than I'm working on here, then if you just have a look at my YouTube channel, there's one called Origami Paper Bow, and it will show you in detail how to make it. This is more about putting the canvas together. So I'm making teeny tiny bows, and I want to make them in all the Distress Ink colours. So I've started out by colouring my squares, and the squares that I'm using to make my bows are 1 3/4 inches. This is the smallest square that I've made a bow with so far, but you never know, I might, once this little escapade has worn off, I might try again with a slightly smaller one. I'm putting the ink onto the paper squares directly from the ink pad, that way I get a nice depth of colour. As you can see, I've given up using my fingers because it is going to get rather messy, and I'm using another piece of paper just to hold the squares while I ink them. I suggest you do the same. And the other thing to do is, because I want all the colours to be clean, is to make sure that you tidy up and wipe off your craft mat in between colours. So you need to colour both sides of one square for each colour. So that's 48 squares in all, and this is the final black soot square. You can tell by the changing light conditions on my videos that this project did take me a little while to do, so it's definitely something that you need to spread out over a couple of days, and that way you don't get too fed up with making thousands of bows. So I've got to make 48 bows in total, and I found the best way to do it was to do it in stages. So I'm folding it so far, and then I'll do some cutting, and then I'll do some folding it into its final shape. So I'm not going to bore you with that here because, like I said, there is a tutorial and you can watch it at your leisure and learn how to make these little bows. I do suggest though that you practice on some big ones first and then move on, once you've mastered that technique, to these little tiny ones, and they are perfect for cards and things, so they're well worth trying out. As is often the way when you're designing something, a problem leads to a solution that perhaps you might not have thought of otherwise. And it was while I was thinking about how was I going to evenly space my bows, considering that I wanted to paint my canvas cream, how would I be able to see the lines that I've carefully, as you can see, drawn onto my canvas? So I used my Tim Holtz ruler in the first instance, and I knew I needed 48 squares at least. So I've gone for an 8 by 8 square, and I'm aware that I'm going to have 8 squares over at the end. So I've got a little design plan up my sleeve for that as well. So one thing leads to another, and in the end you end up with a design that might have not been the original design you thought of. But here we go. So I've cut out for the outside of my grid some chipboard strips that measure 1/4 inch, and I'm using them as the frame for my grid. And then I've used some 1/8 inch strips, 1/8 inch strips of card, which you can see I've already placed all the way across my grid, and then I'm going to cut all the cross sections because I don't really want to overlap the pieces of card so that I end up with too much bulk as one strip overlays another. So it takes a little while, but I think it's well worth it at the end. So I'm just cutting little spaces and filling in the rest of my grid with pieces of card. So I finished my chipboard grid, and now I'm ready to put a quote. I wanted a quote around the outside of my grid so that it acted like a frame around all the bows. So I had a quick look on the internet to find a quote about colour, and I found this one: "You put the colour in my life." And I liked it because it was appropriate for what I was doing. I wanted to do a piece of artwork that it was a kind of homage to my Distress Inks. I use them so often, and they're so useful in so many different ways. So this canvas is definitely a celebration of all the colours that I've got available in my Distress Ink palette. I had some little wooden letters that were the perfect size to fit around the frame of my canvas, and as you can see from my letter Y there with the end missing, I've had to improvise on a few of my letters because I didn't have enough of some of them. And it's always worth looking at your letters to see if perhaps you've got a letter missing, if you could put it together from two other letters. I used an X and part of the letter I to make a couple of Y's that I had missing, and I also had a shortage of U's, so I used a J and again another little piece of the letter I. And once I was sure all my 3D elements were firmly stuck in place, I got out my acrylic paint, and I'm using just a Deco Art Crafters Acrylic Light Antique White. The reason I've chosen this off-white is because I'm not really a great fan of white. There's something about it, it's a bit too stark for my taste. So, but you could, if you prefer white, you could do this with white if you wanted to, or maybe even a grey would look quite nice. But I'm going for this antique white, and I'm going to coat everything and be careful to, to make sure you get in all the nooks and crannies so that every single part that you've stuck onto your canvas is covered with a coat of acrylic paint. So once I've done one coat, then I'm going to let it dry and I will come back and give it a second coat. As this canvas was coming together, I thought I'd quite like to bring some colour to the edge of my box canvas. It isn't something that I ended up using, and I debated whether to leave it in here or not, but the reason I didn't use it was because I didn't have much space between the edge of my canvas and the tops of my letters, so it just didn't look quite right. I'm leaving it in because you might have that extra space, and I think I would have used it had that not been the case. So I'm going to show you, this strips obviously are 12 inches because my canvas is 12 inches, and luckily for me there was not any great maths needed to work out that if I divided it up into 1/4 inch strips I would have enough to do a distress ink rainbow. So I used my schoolboard to divide the strip into 1/4 inch pieces, and then all I'm doing is using my distress inks to colour exactly the same pattern that I will put on my canvas. So I'm following the pinks through to the oranges and yellows exactly as you will see when I put the canvas together, is exactly as my bows will be laid out on my canvas. So I'm just going to recap. You're going to cut a strip of paper to the length of the sides of your canvas. So I've got a 12 inch strip which is the same depth as my canvas, and then I've divided it by 1/4 inch segments using my schoolboard. Then the other thing, that because I only wanted a narrow border sitting over the top of my canvas, I've also scored it at 1/8 of an inch, which you can see at the very top of my strip. So here's a recap of all the elements that I've got so far. There's my paper distress ink rainbows. I've also got 4 daisy flowers that I've made out of cream cardstock. Again, I'm not going to show you how to make these, one because I'm actually selling a tutorial over on my Etsy shop, but also because it depends what you want to do with your canvas, whether you'd want to put these flowers on. I toyed with the idea of using photographs, but I've ended up using these flowers, and I'll show you more later on. And of course I've also got 48 teeny tiny distress ink bows. Now I'm going to show you my idea for putting it all together, and I hope it inspires you perhaps to give something like this a go and see how you would design your distress ink canvas. I'm going to use my framing strip to remind me of the order of colour that I want to place my bows on my canvas, and I'm using a PVA glue, a cosmic shimmer glue, to stick my bows into their little places on my grid. I'm really happy with how this grid's turned out. It looks lovely now, it's all painted cream, and actually I think that I may well do an all cream canvas as a result of doing this little project. Remember I told you that I had 8 blank squares once I'd used the 48 for my distress ink bows. I've decided to use my cream daisies to sit in those squares. I did think about using photographs at one point, but I decided I'm going to keep this canvas completely arty. So I wanted to use or introduce some more cream into all the colour of my distressing bows. So I'm placing them all first in the correct order, then I'm going to go back with my glue and I'm going to attach each of the bows into position in the centre of those squares. And obviously it's quite important to try and keep your bows at the same height along each of your rows. So once all my bows were glued on and dry, I picked up my canvas and I had a little play with the frame. As you can see, that's what I intended, just a small amount of colour showing on the top of the canvas, but a nice rainbow frame around the outside. Like I said, I decided I didn't like it in the end because there just wasn't enough space for it. I think I've just about managed to finish this in time to upload it this week for the Simon Says Stamp and Show challenge. I hope you find this walkthrough of my art project or my challenge piece useful and that it inspires you to make something colourful of your own. I know that because I really like this cream on cream effect that I'm going to do a canvas that's got no colour at all. Thank you for watching.